In this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to take a brand new Spring Boot and Spring Security project from scratch and add OAuth-based authentication using Facebook and GitHub. Whoa, hang on a second. What? OAuth-based authentication? Well, all along we've been talking about OAuth as something that does authorization only and not authentication. How can someone possibly use OAuth for authentication via using Facebook or GitHub or whatever else? But how is it possible, Kaushik? You've been talking about authorization all along. Well, good question, Kaushik. This is something that people have developed as a way to authenticate, even though OAuth wasn't originally meant for authentication. In this tutorial, I'm going to tell you how people have managed to get OAuth to work for authentication, and I will demonstrate how this works with Facebook, and also tell you why it's not always a good idea. Let's check this out. So the example we've taken is of a user trying to use a photo printing service in order to access a file on Google Drive. The way the photo printing service can access something on Google Drive is by doing an OAuth, because the service really cannot get the user's Google credentials in order to authorize that request. Here, the assumption is that the user has already authenticated to the photo printing service and they've already authenticated to Google Drive. And the problem is to just have these two services talk to each other. All right, so we have two services that both trust the user, but these two services don't trust each other in turn. All right, this was the intended usage of OAuth, to have services authorize with other services. But now put yourself in the shoes of someone who is building that photo printing service, right? Someone who's building that client who's trying to access the resource server. What do you have to do if you're building a client and you need to access that resource server, right? First thing, you're going to have to set up authentication by yourself, right? You're creating a service, you're creating a photo printing service or whatever else service that you're working on. You need to authenticate your user first. They may have a Google account, they may have a Facebook account, whatever else, but you have your own service that you need to authenticate your users to. So you build that authentication service, and then once you authenticated with the client is going to say, yes, now you know who I am. Now please access this resource server on my behalf. And then the client has to build in the ability to access the resource server. Now you are building this client, and now you go, hang on a minute, I am going to use OAuth to access maybe Google, maybe Facebook or whatever else, and I can get information about this user's Google account or Facebook account or GitHub account. You know that you can use OAuth to get it. And what do you do when you access that resource server and make an OAuth request? You're basically validating that user's Google account. When you're successfully done OAuth for Google, for example, let's say the resource server is Google, you know that that user has a Google account and you know what that email ID is, right? Google's OAuth API can give you the email ID. Now you're probably going to go, well, if that is the case, why do I have to implement authentication all over again? This user has already authenticated with Google. Google has a reliable authentication mechanism. Thousands and millions of people are using it. So I'm just going to rely on Google's authentication. If the user has successfully authenticated and if Google says, yes, this user is authenticated and I trust him or her, then that's fine enough for me. If Google says this person is reliable and authenticated, I'm just going to rely on Google's verdict. So this is typical when you're building an application and you're interfacing with a resource server, which is a very popular service. So something like Google or Facebook or LinkedIn or GitHub, these are popular services. So if a user has an account with that particular service, you can easily kind of delegate authentication to that and go, okay, if I'm able to successfully OAuth to one of these services and I get an email ID and that service says this person is authenticated, now I have a one-to-one mapping to an account on my end. I can create an account on my end, or I can just rely on Google or Facebook's account and say, okay, if Google is happy enough to trust this user, that's good enough for me. I'm going to trust this user as well. So when the client does this, the client kind of avoids setting up authentication on their own, and it just relies on Google's authentication or Facebook's authentication. that is basically us using OAuth, which was originally meant for authorization to access an API. And now we are kind of using that to leverage some other service for authentication purposes, while us having to avoid building an authentication on our own. Okay, so here's how it works. When you create a Spring Security app, we are working in the context of Spring Security here. So let's say we create a Spring Security app. You have a choice of either building authentication on your own, or you can say, well, I'm just going to make an OAuth call to Google. If this person has a Google account, I'm going to make an OAuth call to Google. Now Google might say, hey, I don't know this person. Or Google might say, yes, I know this person. He is a legitimate user. And here is this person's email ID that I have verified. Now you, building a Spring Security app, can go, well, that's good enough for me. I don't have to build an authentication myself. So this is going to make an OAuth call to get the user's profile information. Once it gets the user's profile information, your Spring Security app is going to put that in the security context to simulate a logged in user. It's almost as if the user is logged in, but basically what you're doing is not forcing the user to log in. You're using Google's OAuth API to get the Google profile information, okay? Which is technically what authentication is all about anyway. User enters the username and password, for example, and you pick up that user's profile and save it in the security context so that you know who the current user is. This is all you're doing, but rather than accessing your database or your authentication APIs, you're using OAuth to get Google or Facebook's profile APIs and using that to figure out who the user is. Okay, so this is what we're going to be building in this tutorial. We're going to create a new Spring Security app from the scratch, and we're going to make this interaction happen. Okay, since this is a very common flow, Spring Security has a really cool annotation which lets you do this OAuth single sign-on functionality just by sticking a simple annotation in there and just configuring it. So it makes it super simple. But I want you to understand that this is the concept behind this. Now here, you might not even want any other API from Google. Like we looked at the photo printing service and we said, okay, the photo printing service might need to access photos from Google Drive, which was the reason why you wanted to do OAuth. In this particular case, once you have this OAuth to get the user's authentication session established, you may not even talk to Google after that. You may not even talk to Facebook. You don't even need any of those APIs. You're doing OAuth just to get to know if Google has trust in this particular user or if Facebook has trust in this particular user. And if those services have a logged in session, then you're going to say, yes, that's my authentication. And you might not even bother to call any other APIs after that. All right, you're using an OAuth call just for getting the user's profile. Let's see how to do this using a brand new Spring Security project. Okay, so let's start out with a brand new Spring Security project. I'm going to go to Spring Initializer at start.spring.io, and I'm going to call this io.javabrains. The artifact name is going to be, let's say, Spring Security Facebook login. All right, and then I'm going to add a couple of dependencies here. The first thing I'm going to add is the web dependency, and then I'm also going to add the Spring Security dependency. So with these two, we should be good to go. There is an OAuth dependency that start.spring.io doesn't support, at least as of me recording this. So that dependency is something I'm going to add after I've opened this project in IntelliJ. Okay, so I'm going to download this, have this load, and then I'm going to open this project in IntelliJ. All right, so here's my project in IntelliJ. Here's the application class. I'm going to go to the pom.xml, and here you see these are the two dependencies that we have downloaded from start.spring.io. I'm going to add a third dependency, which is what will enable this kind of an OAuth sign-in. All right, so this is called Spring Security OAuth 2 Auto Configure. Okay, so this is what will give me access to that single sign-on ability that I will leverage. All right, so the version I'm going to choose will be, let's pick the latest version, 2.1.8 is good enough. All right, so now that I have this, I can actually go back and make this Spring Security application an OAuth 2 SSO application, which is basically saying, hey, Spring Security, just do OAuth-based authentication. All right, so I do that by sticking this one annotation in here, which is called enable OAuth to SSO. It's not enable OAuth to client. OAuth to client is when you want to make an API call and you don't want to leverage OAuth for authentication. This is when you want to leverage OAuth for authentication, you use enable OAuth to SSO. All right, so this is the annotation. Now, this annotation is coming from that dependency that we added in pom.xml. All right, so that's where it's available. That's this artifact. Now, using this artifact in here in the class path and putting that annotation out there is going to make sure that this application is ready to do single sign-on. Spring Security is going to look at that annotation and go, okay, now this is not an application where there is innate login capability. We will be using single sign-on, so we will be leveraging something external for logging in. Well, that begs the question, where is it going to get that external information from? What is Spring Security going to call to get that login information? So for that, what Spring Security is going to do is it's going to open the configuration file, right? So every Spring Boot project comes with this application.properties, and this is where you set all your application properties. This is where Spring Security OAuth to SSO client is going to look to see, okay, who do I have to call? Who do I have to access to get this OAuth information to verify this user's authentication? Well, right now, this is empty. And the first thing I'm going to do is change this to a YAML file because that makes it simple. And I don't have to do a bunch of dots everywhere. YAML has this kind of nested structure, which lets me put properties and configure it very easily. And now here, I'm going to paste this block of configuration that is useful for authentication with Facebook and with GitHub. Okay, I'm going to get this block of configuration literally from the spring.io guides page, which I will link in the video. But this is where you will find what are the typical configuration values that you would need. The one thing that you would need to do, though, is to set up an application in your target platform, right? The identity provider platforms. Let's say you want to authenticate with Facebook. You need to set up an application in Facebook. So I'm going to show you how to do that in Facebook, but it really depends on which platform you're choosing to use, right? If you want to do authentication with login with Google feature for your Spring Security app, you're going to have to set up an app in Google. You want to do this with GitHub, you need to set up an app in GitHub, right? So you need to tell the platform first that, hey, I am this person. I am going to be creating an application which is going to leverage your authentication. So you need to tell that up front. And let me show you how to configure something like this with Facebook. The way to do that with Facebook is to go to developers.facebook.com. Here's how this page looks like today. This may look very different for you when you're watching this video, but basically I need to go to this My Apps section. And here is where you have all your available apps. And there is a Create App button here, which lets you create a new app. I'm going to create, let's say, a test app. Okay, so this is a new app that I'm going to be creating, and I'm going to be using the keys generated by this app in order to do the authentication. And now here I have my application ready, and I'm going to go to this basic section where I have a couple of pieces of information here. You notice there is this thing called the app ID. Okay, the app ID is what uniquely identifies this app for Facebook. Every identity provider, I think, has a similar concept. You have this concept of an app ID. And then you have this thing called the app secret. The app secret is that secret key which only a developer would know. All right, so you're going to need both of these values in order to tell Spring Security, whom to call and whom to access. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to copy these two values. I'm going to copy this block of configuration, which is pretty standard no matter which identity provider you use. And I'm going to demonstrate how to do that by switching it to GitHub later. Okay, so this block has everything that Spring Security needs. It's security.oauth.client. You have a bunch of properties which tell Spring Security where to access the identity information and what is the client ID and the client secret. Okay, so these are the two values that we just saw by creating this app on Facebook. I'm going to have to go plug those values in here and put this in here, but the rest of the stuff can remain as is. Okay, so I have the app ID. I'm copying that, which is the client ID here. And I'm also going to paste the client secret. I am going to get rid of this particular application in the client secret after I have published this video, But remember that the client secret is something that's private. You don't want to be pushing this to a source code repository. You don't want to be showing it to other people, because whoever has the client ID and the client secret can kind of simulate an access to Facebook as your app, and any API quotas and all that stuff will be associated with you. So make sure the client secret is truly a secret. But for your application, this is where you would save it. And with this, you're pretty much done. Now, believe it or not, you can actually run this application. And now what's going to happen is Spring Security is going to say, okay, this is an OAuth to SSO application. It's going to look at the configuration in application.yaml, and it's going to make a call to Facebook. It knows what to call, what acknowledgement to get, and all that stuff. It's going to make an OAuth call with the authorization token. Okay, it's going to make an authorization token, and it's going to make an access token. It's going to get an access token after that, and that's the authorization token flow that it's going to follow. Just out of the box feature, which is really cool. Now, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my static folder here, and I'm going to create a new HTML file so that there is something to see when authentication is successful. Okay, so I'm just going to put this in here and put some simple message here. I'm going to call it hello user. All right, something nice for the user to see after they've authenticated. Okay, so now let me start running this application. I'm going to go here and start this main application, run as a Java app. So it's going to start up. And then I can access localhost 8080. And guess what happens? When I access localhost 8080, Spring Security is not going to show its login form anymore, the default login form that comes with an out-of-the-box Spring application, a Spring Security application. It is going to directly redirect to Facebook, and it's going to automatically assume that you want Facebook authentication. It's going to take all that stuff. So if you access localhost 8080, you notice here, it's automatically redirected to Facebook, and it says, test app will receive your name and profile picture. Okay, what's test app? It's the app that we created. So anytime you want to have an application contact Facebook for this kind of an OAuth flow, you have to tell Facebook up ahead that this is what it is, so that when a user is trying to use your app, it can tell you this information. You can even provide an icon so that you can see that there. So the user will know, oh, this is the app that is trying to access my profile. I was the one who tried to access it, so this is legit. So I can click on continue as user. Okay. I'm not going to click this because of various different reasons related to my Facebook profile and my application. But let me demonstrate this with GitHub so that you know exactly how this looks like. All right. So here I have updated the application.yaml with GitHub properties. And again, I picked this up from the spring.io guides. But basically the idea is I am using the client ID and the client secret by letting GitHub know ahead of time that this is an application that might come your way and ask for authentication information. And I have set up over here so that our Spring application and Spring Security knows whom to call. Now with this, I'm going to restart this application, and let me demonstrate what the flow looks like with GitHub. So when I access localhost 8080, notice the screen that I get. It says, this is the application that wants to access your public data. Do you want to allow, right? The name of the application is Spring Cloud Local Demo. This is again from the sample that I got from spring.io, right? So if I click on authorize, you notice here it also says authorizing will redirect to localhost 8080, which is the URL of the application. All right, I'm going to click on authorize, and I can also look at other information that it's looking for. Click on authorize. It redirects back to localhost 8080, and we see the template placeholder page that we have set up over there, which is hello user. Now this means that the user has successfully authenticated. Now what Spring Security has done is it's made a call to GitHub's profile API, gotten the profile information, and plugged that in as the security context. So Spring Security thinks this is an authenticated user. We have pretty much replaced the normal Spring Security authentication flow with this OAuth flow to get profile information and kind of substitute the currently logged in user, the current principal, in memory. So this is out of the box feature that comes with Spring Security, and it's super handy if you want to use this, because again, like I said, this kind of authentication has become very common now. Before we wrap up, I want to point out a couple of reasons why it's not always a good idea to have this kind of delegated authentication with something like Google or Facebook. The first reason is, since this is OAuth, there's an authorization token and an access token in place. So when somebody authenticates with Google, for example, and you are confident about the security of the service, so let's say I'm super confident about the photo printing service that I give access to Google, then I am a little more open to doing that. But if the application that I'm trying to access is not something that I'm very confident about, then a user has good reason to refuse to provide access to the Google profile information. Because if that access token gets lost, there is always a possibility of someone else impersonating as that user. The second reason is when there is this OAuth exchange that happens, the thing that the application is validating is that the user has logged into Google at that point in time when you do the sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook. However, if the application is holding on to that token and probably logging the user in maybe a week from now and still saying, okay, last time I checked, I had the OAuth user, so I'm still good to go, then that may not be valid anymore. The user might have logged out of Google. The user might have deleted a Google account. So if an application is using OAuth tokens to authenticate, then it would have to do this every time. Okay, it has to make sure that it's current and not rely on an authentication attempt that was done a while back. Again, I'm not saying that this is very bad because it works, it's simple, and so many people have used it. So not all those people are likely to be wrong, but there is a lot of good material online which also warns against extensive use of this thing. But as long as you're keeping your tokens safe and providing trustworthy service, I think this is a good alternative for implementing the whole authentication mechanism yourself.